Okay. So my name is Serhiy Plokhy. I'm the professor of history. I'm a professor of history here in the Department of History and member of executive board of Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. And today is my pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker, Matthew Polly. He is an associate professor of history at Michigan State University. At Michigan State, he is a core faculty member of the Center for European and Eurasian Studies and affiliate faculty member of the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel. He is the author of Breaking the Tongue, Language, Education, and Power in Soviet Ukraine, as well as numerous journal articles and book chapters on early Soviet nationalities policy, education, childhood, medicine, and urban identity in the Russian Empire and Soviet Ukraine. He has won grants from the Swiss National Science Foundation, the US Fulbright Program, IREX, ACTR, ACCELS. I don't know what it is. I will ask.
American Council.
Later. Okay, good. And the Shevchenko Scientific Society. I know that. Plus the Canadian Foundation for Ukrainian Studies. Dr. Polly is currently engaged in the writing of a research monograph, City of Children, Juvenile Poverty, Crime, and Salvation in Odessa. In the fall of 2024, he was a visiting scholar affiliated with the chair of East European History and the Graduate School of History at the University of Basel. He is a partner of the Oxford Ukraine Hub and a member of the H Ukraine Advisory Board. So Matthew, it's really a pleasure having you here, and we all certainly look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Serhiy. It's an honor to be here. It truly is. I feel among friends. I have actual friends in the room, but I feel this is a place that is dear to me, where we're just reminiscing about, or at least I was reminiscing about my time studying Ukrainian here in the summer through Harry, and it's a pleasure to be back. I remember also viewing on Zoom when my graduate student John Shetichko was making a presentation, I think in this very room, and asking a question from afar. So it's good to be among you. So I'd like to thank Harry, certainly Serhiy, Kat, and Megan, everyone who's made this trip possible. I have to warn you, I got up at 2:30 in the morning in East Lansing, Michigan to make the journey here. I'm fueled with some caffeine enjoyed with Dr. Kuramia, who sits across from me, my former dissertation advisor at Indiana University. So I feel caffeinated for the moment. I'd also like to thank my colleague, Zhenya Monastyrsky, who's here today and has been supportive with this work. I think as an American historian of Ukraine, we're kind of a strange category, those of us who didn't grow up in the Ukrainian American or Ukrainian Canadian community. And I put myself in this category, but I think just generally in the United States, we need to thank our Ukrainian colleagues. I don't suspect too many people are up in Ukraine, and God knows what they're facing now in Ukraine on this night, but I feel incumbent to say something about my colleagues in Ukraine, particularly those at the Institute of History, who have been have been extremely hospitable to me through the course of my career, particularly the Department of History of Ukraine for the 1920s and 1930s. I have many good colleagues there, as well as the Department of Ukrainian History at Mechnikov University in Odessa, where I was lucky to spend a Fulbright semester only, where I accumulated a massive amount of material that I am still quite honestly working through. But I'd like to, just in case anyone's viewing from Odessa online, I'd like to extend my thanks to them, the current faculty, as well as recent graduates of the program, all of whom have been inspirational to me. This may seem somewhat unconventional, but I think it's worth doing, we as historians should also thank those who enable our work. That is the amazing archivists at Archives Around Ukraine, but certainly for me, the Derzhavny Archiv Odeskoi Oblasti. I've been able to get not a huge amount of files since the full-scale invasion, but some files sent to me, and it's through the amazing dedication of archivists in Odessa that I have, frankly, anything further to work with on this project, as well as the amazing librarians at the Odessa National Scientific Library. And lastly, in terms of thanks, I would just like to acknowledge maybe what for you in the room is self-evident. Writing about a city in Ukraine is an ambitious thing, because there are many great historians of municipal history, in particular Odessa. Odessa has its own school of historians of Ukraine, some of whom passed through Mechnikov but are not affiliated with the university. There is a vibrant program of study, if you can call it that, or field of study of Odessa history, and I was lucky enough to meet some of these people and stay connected with them. So I'd just like to acknowledge also, as we proceed with the formal part of the talk, that the images I'm using here are all in the public domain, or they're from the Centralny Derzhavny Kino-Fotofono Archiv, or from the Odessa Law Academy. So you'll see images courtesy of them. I'm lucky, frankly, to have images for historians. That can sometimes be a difficult thing. And then lastly, what I'm presenting today is a kind of introduction to my work. I've been working on this project for really too many years in bits and pieces. I've been distracted by other things, and most certainly the war. I would love to get back to Odessa and work in the archive. My last information is the archive remains closed to the general public, and frankly to scholars as well. All requests are done remotely. I'd just like to, I suppose, acknowledge that fact, but also that this work began there, and what I'm presenting today is a sort of, I think, the most digestible take on this history that that is part of a larger book manuscript, as Serhiy described. It is derived from an article published in East-West Journal of Ukrainian Studies, a special issue on Odessa, which I encourage you, if you're interested in Odessa. We may have Odessans here among us, but it's a wonderful issue. All the articles on Odessa, guest edited by Volodymyr Kravchenko and Jessica Sikovich. And I'm grateful for the reviewers who responded to the initial iteration of this work. They made the work that much better. Obviously, all shortcomings are my own. So I also think I'm a bit odd in the sense that a lot of people work on Odessa, yeah? I know this obviously from surveying the history that has been written, but frankly, just sitting in the archive. The Odessa Oblast Archive is an old synagogue, Brodsky Synagogue, that is truly falling apart. But it is still a jewel of Odessa. All historians, I think, want the archive to remain in the city, and I hope it will be so. I worry, of course, when any munition falls near this archive, because before the full-scale invasion, it already seemed to be lovingly propped up, but propped up all the same. I think Odessan history can be written about through multiple lenses, but I come at it most certainly through the lens of Ukrainian history. This is how I was trained, and this has been my longtime love, is what I would freely admit to you and proudly admit to you. When I was writing this book, Breaking the Tongue, I was looking for a place to investigate, to sort of have a case test what was Ukrainianization, Soviet Ukrainianization. And so I turned to Odessa partly because the Central Archives led me there. There was a fair amount of resistance to Soviet linguistic Ukrainianization in Odessa, but it also was just a very pleasant place in which to work. I've always felt when I've worked in the archive there that I've become sort of a half archivist, or at least a member of the archival community. So I have a chapter in this book on Ukrainianization in Odessa. There's also other chapters on children, on the young pioneers. So it's not just about schools, but that's how I was kind of introduced to Odessa. And I had trouble actually getting in the archive when I first came. The director of the archive was away. And so I contacted Mechnikov University, and I met a wonderful historian who took me out to the site of the Comintern Children's Town #1 that you'll learn about today. The project is more than just a history of this particular children's town, but nevertheless, Odessans know of its history, and they know where this institution used to be. It is now the site of the Odessa Legal Academy, and the librarians of the Odessa Legal Academy have kept a sort of certainly photo archive of what this was, as well as some other records. It's not in any way a full history of the children's town, but nevertheless, that's how I came to this project. Frankly, doing this research for Breaking the Tongue so many years ago, I discovered the real pressing issue in Odessan history of street children. So in 1927, the celebration of the 10-year anniversary of the October Revolution was a momentous occasion in the Soviet Union. In Odessa, in the Ukrainian Republic, cash-strapped local authorities tried to leverage the event to fulfill what they viewed as a sacred obligation. Preservation of Soviet gains required vigilance and memorialization. The defenders of the city's premier children's institution, the Comintern Children's Town #1, proudly claimed the shelter as a living monument to the achievements of the October Revolution. The model children's town would not just transform its wards, it would also restructure them as replacements for the heroic fallen. And as such, they would function as inspirational exemplars for Odessa's large number of children under state care. Two impediments I would submit to you stood in the way: the perceived corrupting, unpredictable nature of Odessa, and really the subject of this talk, the prevalence of disease, itself a product of the urban environment. Although the Soviets exploited the compulsory powers of the state in their search for a remedy, they were motivated by a professed ambition to relieve human suffering, especially among the revolution's first generation. The martyrs of October would seem to have demanded it. So this talk focuses on I would submit, understudied attempts to stem the tide of contagion among the so-called bezpritulny, or abandoned children, because progress on this front was a critical precondition to overall achievement. I argue that although there are many, many studies on street children in Ukrainian bezpritulny, the challenge of locality can be lost in sweeping studies of the problem of children's homelessness that address the limits of institutional control, but tend to amplify the pretensions of state undertakings. As it regards disease, most certainly, municipal authority mattered more than central authority. The walls of places like the Children's Town failed to wholly circumscribe its ward, and disease was a perennial interloper. The city loomed just beyond the boundaries of any institution. The campaign required the participation of the wider city in the identification of contagion, the association of disease with immorality, and the perpetuation of the image of good health. The Soviets in Odessa could tap into its formidable scientific expertise, and success promised benefit for the whole city. What emerged from their efforts, I would argue, was a biopolitical script written in the name of the collective good. As historian Tricia Starks has argued, the cleansed body was not just the building block of the socialist utopia, it became the material manifestation of the revolution's success. According to this script, the fit hands of the politically conscious and morally upright young, trained in places like the Comintern Children's Town No. 1, would construct a socialist utopia, and the state would wither away. So street children were a perennial concern in Odessa, certainly from the imperial period. I did some research in St. Petersburg in the Russian Historical Archive before things got impossible to work there, and certainly found that to be true. So I went there to study Odessa. There's a long history of street children in Odessa, but the disorder wrought by war, political terror, and famine created a new generation of orphans and semi-orphans. Children from across the former empire sought sanctuary from the winter's cold by riding the rails south to the end of the line in Odessa. Much of what we know about the founding of the most important Odessan institution designed to confront the problem of children's homelessness and the accompanying threat of disease comes from the notes of Vladimir Potyomkin, the 1922 head of the Odessa Provincial Education Department. You'll see his image in a moment. According to Potyomkin, the initiative, however, for the idea of a children's town in Odessa belongs to the then representative of the Odessa Provincial Revolutionary Committee and a future Ukrainian Commissar of Education, somebody whose name I think needs no particular introduction at Curie, since Curie Press published a wonderful book on him. But for those of you who don't know, featured on the slide, Oleksandr Shumsky, one of the foremost proponents of Ukrainianization, and thus a central figure in my previous study. So it was interesting to confront, really quite by accident, him again. In this book I mentioned, there's a brief mention of Odessa, but not of this, I'd say. And I frankly don't know a great deal beyond what I'm telling you here. But nevertheless, I think it's important that the idea emanates from him. When touring Odessa in 1920 with the chief of the Provincial Corrections Department, Shumsky visited an internment camp located on the grounds of a former military cadet academy on Srednofontanska to the south of the center of Odessa. Shumsky found it odd that prisoners incarcerated by Soviet justice lived in a well-furnished building and were provided with regular meals, while many of Odessa's forlorn children lived in overcrowded, unsanitary, and disease-ridden conditions. Therefore, he resolved to thoroughly transform the building and farmstead of the military school, as well as the settlement of dachas and the beach and bathing area of the former Arcadia Health Resort, located within walking distance. His goal was to transfer multiple children's institutions, effectively orphanages and boarding schools, to this particular site and unite them in one organization under one management. On June 12, 1920, the new Odessan Soviet government designated a provincial council for the defense of children with wide authority for creating a proposed children's town, in Ukrainian, Mistechko. It formed a special administrative board dedicated to this task. The site of the children's town was not settled, but Shumsky strongly advocated for the use of the cadet academy that I've just described to you. Because of its relatively recent construction as a large training facility, its embrace of over 5 acres of land, and a proprietary electrical station and central heating system. It was, in short, a kind of expression of modernity. The Odessan Children's Town promised not just the conversion and control of a Tsarist-era military space, but I'd suggest to you its functional transposition. Soviet-trained children would replace agents of reaction. Right? This was the site where enemies of the Soviet state had only recently been incarcerated, and now the first generation of Soviet citizens would be trained there. Importantly, to operationalize their plan, the organizers of the Comintern Children's Town and other children's institutions in the city of Odessa deferred to a range of medical expertise. Despite concerns about sanitation, the question of the aptitude of the site was reportedly based on a special medical authority provided by the Odessa Provincial Health Department. A planning commission formally appointed a doctor for every 2 to 3 schools in this massive assemblage of children's institutions. And one senior doctor was also appointed for a 60-bed hospital to be located on the site of the children's town. In short, the commission presented wellness as a determinative criterion for the town's creation. The variety of medical evaluative mechanisms instituted by local authorities testifies, I'd suggest to you, to the importance that they gave to the town's function as a curative as well as prophylactic institution. Nearly 1 year later, in April 1921, the Council of People's Commissars, the highest executive authority of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, issued a decree declaring that the settlement was an experimental institution and bequeathing it with the full formal name that I've already used here, the Communist International or Comintern State Model Children's Town, later designated Children's Town number 1. There were 3 such children's towns in the city of Odessa, but this was the largest and this had the longest life and was the most prestigious. As a consequence, lessons regarding the medical care of children would have importance, I'd suggest to you, for the entire Ukrainian Republic. This was a model institution meant to be held up as a paragon of the way in which children's welfare would be practiced. And I'd suggest also not just for the Ukrainian Republic, but what became the Soviet Union as a whole. However, health concerns troubled the early years of the town. The town was located some 7 kilometers outside of the city center, and its supply of medical provisions and other essential aid was sparse due to the unavailability of transport. It doesn't seem like a tremendous distance for those of you who've been to Odessa. It certainly would not be. But in these days, following revolution and civil war, transportation was hard to come by. And that inevitably affected the livelihood of the town. The onset of winter hampered the initial organization of the proposed hospital in the town, as children huddled together without heating oil, clean linens, soap, or medicine, and little in the way of food. Infections spread rapidly among all residents in the town, and scurvy felled undernourished young bodies. Administrators blame these contagions on multiple factors. Obviously, the absence of soap and medicine meant that the staff could not bathe children or launder clothing. Perhaps as a measure of self-preservation, I suggest to you, some employees of the town resorted to buying medicine out of pocket for the children in an effort to stave off illness in the town. By the summer of 1921, the town's population had expanded to 2,000 and become one of the largest children's facilities in, again, what became the Soviet Union. We're not at the point of the creation of the Soviet Union. And I think this is, we do well to remind ourselves that this begins as a story of Soviet Ukraine. I can return to that if you'd like in the Q&A. But whether the Department of Health liked it or not, local authorities considered this assemblage of children's institutions to be the premier pediatric health institution in Odessa. Children kept on arriving to the town, and often they were unclothed, sick, and weak. And despite the medical role that Odessa authorities had signed to it, in his history, Potyomkin expresses an exasperation with the expansion of the town's population, an annoyance that must have been reflected in the feelings of the town's staff at the time. He argues that there should have been a temporary stoppage or cessation in the admission of children while the town waited to receive desperately needed supplies. Instead, the Department of Education continued to press for the entry of new children until the town simply became overwhelmed. The influx of new children motivated the creation of a unit in the children's hospital to quarantine children infected with scabies, a parasite which touched some 70% of the children's population. Cases of diphtheria, scarlet fever, and measles among the new wards led to their separate housing as well. Most seriously, typhus. For anyone who knows this history will not be surprised by this fact, but typhus was reported in the town's Yiddish language kindergarten after an employee contracted the infection while washing and dressing new arrivals. The fact that most of the children were around 30% lighter than the normal weight for their age meant they were less able to successfully fight off disease. There's a certain irony, I would argue, in the administrator's frustration with the entrance, right? The fact that more and more children were coming. After all, resolution of disease was one of the chief reasons for the town's creation. The provincial education department especially saw value in assembling sick children in one place to marshal its resources towards a single revolutionary goal, the uplifting and training of neglected children. Furthermore, even though Department of Health administrators warned against the absence of adequate sewage for the site and its grandiose size, they were not in principle against the idea of grouping sick children to better treat them and to gather medical knowledge. However, the town's leaders did not want disease to reach such a scale that it interfered with the town's really, in the end, primary missions, that is pedagogical training and pedagogical and political training. The solution that they ultimately settled on was the separation of the sickest children. In January 1921, children who contracted typhus were placed in an isolation unit in the center of the city, that is in the center of the city of Odessa, and those with severe ringworm were transferred to a municipal hospital for epilation by X-ray. And we don't have adequate data about their return, but I think it is notable that they were removed again from this model children's institution, which was supposed to be a curative place. By 1922, the town's health situation was said to have improved remarkably, despite what I've just told you. Infectious diseases continued to occur, but their spread was reportedly quickly contained, and the remaining children, again, according to the official history that is provided by Potyomkin, the children flourished. The purported quixotic formula for success was baths, country air, again, if you consider this the country, it is outside the center of the city, and swimming in the sea, and thus the importance of access to the Arcadia former resort area. Those of you who've been to Odessa will know precisely of what I speak. In reality, disease persisted in the town and certainly persisted beyond the walls of the Comintern Children's Town. That is within the larger city. Odessa, however, I would argue, was exceptionally situated to pursue remediation of illness, not only because of its long history of fighting disease as a port city long concerned with staving off illness, but because of the investment Soviet authorities made in the medical sciences in the city. It was home to a major university, the former Imperial Novorossiya University, renamed the Odessa Institute of Public Education, or Institut Narodной Osvity, in 1920, and Odessa State University in 1933. The medical department of the university split off and formed the separate Odessa Medical Institution, where leading epidemiologists researched and trained many of the city's doctors. I could give you more names, but I'm going to give you one important one. Numerous hospitals and clinics were located already in the port. Again, this is a port, right? So quarantine of those suspected of being possible carriers of disease was a long-standing concern. So in Odessa already, there was a renowned infectious diseases hospital whose construction began all the way back in 1804. The first urban disinfection station in Ukraine was established in Odessa in the Russian Empire. Since 1894, it had operated as an independent unit of the infectious diseases hospital. And from 1918 to 1928, that is under new Soviet authority, it was run by the noted epidemiologist Levko Hromashevsky. And according to one account, set the standard for anti-epidemic services for the entire Soviet state system. Odessa was thus the heart of medical education and research, certainly in southern Ukraine, if not all of Soviet Ukraine, if not all of the Soviet Union. And thus, again, to repeat my point, it was uniquely positioned to handle the problem of disease in children's bodies. Odessan health authorities seem particularly attached to the new Soviet-defined field of social hygiene. Advocates of this field, whose ranks included the earliest Russian and Ukrainian commissars of public health, right? We should remind ourselves that each republic had its own separate commissariat of health. I remember as a graduate student presenting my work and being asked about the Russian Commissariat of Education as if it was an all-union Commissariat of Education at ACES. These things were separate in regards to education, probably more so, but they also had separate commissariats of public health. Anyhow, both of them believed that disease was first and foremost a social phenomenon, best understood in its social context. In Odessa, the pressing issue of bezpritulny shaped an orientation around the study of the relationship between parental living conditions, child abandonment, and health. The Odessa Medical Institute organized courses on social hygiene, first in 1920, and a separate department dedicated to the discipline in 1923, also headed by Hromashevsky. Figuratively and factually, the Odessan authorities viewed the city of Odessa as the precipitable danger. It tempted children to engage in so-called hooliganism, something that scholars in the audience know something about, most certainly, probably even more so than me, I'd suggest. And Soviet advocates of children's welfare, like those in Odessa, viewed this behavior as a consequence of the capitalist city. Their objective was to place such children in imagined futuristic centers of hygiene, such as the Comintern Children's Town and other reconstructed orphanages. For now, they confronted the reality of life in so-called cities of the past. And just as an aside, when I say reconstructed and cities of the past, that was an actual fact as well, right? Many many Soviet children's homes, many Soviet orphanages occupied the sites of former imperial orphanages. Obviously, what I'm talking to you about today is a sort of different reimagined space, but they're still appropriating territory and infrastructure from the imperial age. So the tie to the imperial age remains very much there. Utopia, in short, would be a work in progress as the streets continued to beckon sinners and existing buildings remained in various states of never-ending repair. A discussion in 1928 of a roundup of street children underscores the evolution of health policy in Odessa. Municipal authorities moved from a strategy of separating and treating sick children who fell into the state's custody to a much more interventionist stance. The Odessa Regional Commission for Assistance to Children, which operated under the Department of Education, a department that I'm intimately familiar with through all my research on Ukrainian language education, so it was quite comforting in a way to return to education files. Anyhow, this Regional Commission for Assistance to Children met on August 15th, 1928, to consider the progress of the operation to collect children from the street. In the context of discussing the detention of Odessa's adolescent homeless, several speakers noted that medical authorities, not the commission members, would determine the placement of those arrested. Youths infected with venereal diseases warranted the greatest concern. One commission member, Rupberg, believed that the commission should first contact the city's hospitals and medical institutes, specifically the respected Glavcha Institute that specialized in venereal disease, a long-standing and well-known institute for the study of venereal disease. But he was a bit perplexed about the possibility of the city being able, or he was worried about the possibility of the city responding. Right? Did the city have the capacity for so many children arrested in this sweep? Amazingly, he conceded that the regional health department, as he put it, does not know how many beds would be needed to accommodate this kind of patient. Only after the medical staff of the city's established specialist centers assess those youths taken from the street would the remainder, ostensibly less serious cases, be treated in disinfection units and presumably passed to conventional children's institutions. The commentary of another commission member, Baumstein, reveals a primary concern with girls infected with syphilis. Although he acknowledged that 300 girls of those rounded up in this sweep might be accommodated in the city of Odessa, there was presently no home to house this number. He maintained that maybe it would be best if they would be sent outside of Odessa, in fact, sent outside of Ukraine to a labor commune in the faraway Russian city of Orol, or somewhere else even further distant, especially since 25% are infected with syphilis, as he put it. It is notable, although not surprising, that the commission saw girls as the carriers of venereal disease as opposed to boys. The focus on girls as a danger and the readiness with which the commission appeared to be willing to exile them from Odessa is telling about the explicitly male nature of this anxiety. In the very same breath that the commission member Rupberg identified venereal disease among the girls, he called for a consultation with pedological or child science experts to ensure that the girls were not only treated, but that the behavior that he presumed had led to their infection was corrected. Although it's not said explicitly, the implication that can be drawn from evidence and other documents is that they engaged in prostitution. The archives contain repeated references to prostitution, when referencing venereal disease, and reports lamented the challenge of educating so-called sexually perverted children. My colleague Viktor Savchenko, one of these amazing historians of Odessa that I've already referenced, who hold this history near and dear to their heart and occasionally led people like myself into this realm of really esteemed experts and people who've spent their long careers studying the city of Odessa and know it well. He argues, or he found in the mid-1920s, authorities discovered that one school of rhythm and dance in the Mali Fontaine neighborhood adjacent to where the Comintern Children's Town was located was a front for a brothel employing 13 to 18-year-old girls recruited from the streets by criminal gangs. Mark Steinberg just published in 2023 a great article in Slavic Review where he investigates the periodical press and has found constant mention of prostitution as a problem in Odessa. That was my experience in surveying the periodical press as well, although Mark found some real colorful expressions of street children in Večernja Izvestia. So presumably some of the girls that I'm talking about through the archival record captured in this roundup had been similarly employed, although the exact archival document that documents these girls doesn't say so explicitly. In its concluding protocol, the commission sanctioned Baumstein's proposal for the girls' removal, right? Girls' removal, again, not just from the collectors in which they were initially housed as part of this roundup operation, and not just from Soviet institutions in Odessa, but from Odessa as a whole, indeed from the Ukrainian Republic. In effect, the commission could use medical authority, the esteemed, established, robust medical authority of Odessa, to provide cover for what it wanted to definitively do, that is, to expunge a juvenile body politic in preparation for change. This detention of street children suggests the limits of the social hygiene approach in Soviet Ukraine. For those entrusted with crafting Soviet health policy, the strategy of re-socialization no longer seemed apt by the late 1920s. Coercion could now be used when quick results had not been achieved. The gradual shunning of the discipline of social hygiene also impacted the application of public health measures. In Odessa, the persistence of Bezpritulny served as a reminder that more than 10 years after the revolution, child abandonment still occurred and enabled the spread of disease. As the worrisome products of social schism and misfortune infected street children required more aggressive forms of containment. And any study of them and their habits and their families from which they came from seemed very much on the back burner. All right, this is by way, I think we started a bit late. I'm trying to time myself and make sure I don't get too long-winded here, but this is by way of conclusion, really returning to the argument that I presented at the outset. The desire to rescue children in Odessa had always been motivated by real fears that threatened to overtake any simple concern for charity. In the Soviet era, this anxiety took on added political overtones for authorities who worried that a child's ill health would compromise the gains of the revolution and serve, in some cases, as a marker of moral ruin. Healthy bodies enabled Soviet children to rationally accept, advocate for, and participate in the socialist economy. Amidst the death and destruction of post-revolutionary Odessa, the campaign for children's welfare promised to replace those lost in the fight for Soviet power. However, the young citizens I would submit to you, who would make up for this shortfall, were in many ways a poor substitute for their predecessors, especially in the early 1920s, but well into the decade. Any visitor to the city would have noticed the emaciated, soiled forms of boys and girls haunting the city's rail stations, markets, and streets. Emboldened by their trust in science, the Soviets sought to exorcise these apparitions by rallying the city's eminent medical institutions to remove problematic use and recast others as a new generation of revolutionaries on the march. Here pictured doing just that. At the end of the decade, a comrade, Natsikanov, notably the former head of the Children's Town's health section, had taken over the directorship of the Comintern Children's Town and lauded anew this campaign for a kind of corporal rebirth. And that's what I'm trying to suggest through some of the images that I'm showing you here about commemoration of the revolution and the losses of revolution. And in April 1930 communique to the Odessa Regional Department of Education, he reminisced, "In the tempest and crash of the Civil War, which was difficult for our region, the Odessa Communist International Children's Town was born. The blood of workers was spent," he argued, "to restore the children to health. A sacrifice had been made. Before the party in Soviet power was placed the critical task of preserving childhood and the new revolutionary generation with native proletarian blood," right? So corporality is in fact specified, or human constitutions. With native proletarian blood, the region expended all its strength, took all opportunity to save, feed, and forge young children fighters. The town celebrated its 10th anniversary by placing the inheritors of this sacrifice on display in a grand gymnastics parade. In fact, the town had not banished disease, hunger, or squalor on its own, but rhetorically the state declared victory through this kind of performative affirmation. But the presentation of progress meant that some children were deemed incapable of rescue. Children were examined, sorted, and classified, and the best candidates were selected for the application of the city's best resources. The wards of the Children's Town represented a kind of selective transformation, achieved, I fully admit, through authentic effort. I think we'd be foolish not to acknowledge the sincerity of this enterprise, but also through bureaucratic choice. This was, in my view, curative myth-making at work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So in our tradition, I will pose the first question or two, and I encourage you all to think about maybe questions or comments that you have, both for those of you who are present here, but also address the same invitation to our online audience. My first question is in more or less in line with the idea of trying to understand this problem that you discussed, the issue that you discussed in the context of the time. So how big is the problem of abandoned, homeless street children? What numbers we are talking about? And I was surprised to hear that in 1928 they discussed still the same problem.
Yeah. Right.
And my guess is by 1932, 1933, with the famine, probably that problem would be there, or maybe would become even more serious than it was before. So would you please tell us a little bit about what?
Significant. So 30,000 living outside children's institutions, according to estimate by Viktor Savchenko in the Oblast of Odessa. So, initially Okruha.
It was a much bigger. It was Okruha and then
Okruha, yes, I think that's correct. it was first Okruha and then, of course, an oblast. So, but in the tens of thousands, most certainly. And Odessa was a major site of street children. So it had one of the largest populations in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. I know I wrote about it in my published article.
If I may ask in that regard, would it be true that the homeless children in Odessa would come not only from Odessa and from the region, but given that it's the south of Ukraine, south of the Soviet Union, Black Sea, that maybe they would get also children from
Absolutely.
From other parts of,
Yeah.
of the country.
So I'm looking at my my writing on this. So 30,000 street children out of a population of approximately 1.1 million in 1923. So that would be, I think, the Hubernia in 1923. Okay. So we have an idea of perspective. But yeah, as I said, I mean, the rail lines end in Odessa, so children are coming via rail by themselves. The other thing that I investigate in the larger work, and I'm engaged in writing about, is the effects of the 1920-21 famine, which certainly affected the Odessa region. But Odessa, because I think of what I've argued here, it's medical facilities, this sort of rather robust network of children's institutions. We can make too much of that. I think we can buy a little too much into the Soviet narrative of this sort of institutionalization of children's welfare achieved at an early date. But nevertheless, this children's town and the other two that I've talked about, where they exist, and in Kyiv, there's children's town as well. But Odessa was well known, and this particular one I talked about was probably the most famous in the Republic. And so this children's town becomes the recipient of children sent from the Volga before there is the Soviet Union. So to me, that's an interesting item for consideration, right? That there is a dialogue between, not surprisingly, between the Soviet Ukrainian Republic and the Russian Republic about the care of children beyond the Ukrainian public in a Ukrainian city, that is in the city of Odessa. So children are coming from there. They're also coming from the Donbass region. The children from the Volga, they want to care for, and then they send them back as soon as possible. That is also a concern, just how long these children from outside Odessa would remain in the city of Odessa. But yes, absolutely, children came. We shouldn't also ignore children coming from the countryside around Odessa, but children are absolutely coming from all over, from points, the archival record's quite clear, from not just the Volga region, but from Siberia and points even further distant.
Okay, thank you. And I'll ask maybe second question and then open the floor for a question and comments from audience. So what is the relation between the children town and something that we know, I understand from later period of time, this is Makarenko and all these children's colonies really run by the NKVD. So is there any relation at all? Or these are completely different projects and different.
I think they are different projects that demand a different kind of researcher. I mean, so the most difficult children are sent to these GPU maintained colonies. That's an archival record that is difficult to access. So I worked in the SBU archive in the Odessa Oblast, SBU archive. That was hard to gain entry to, even in post-2014 Ukraine. And mostly what I found there were files of people who worked for these children's institutions that were arrested. But, you know, so there has been work on this in terms of the children's population in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic generally. I am less interested in it as a historian of Odessa because what I'm really trying to investigate is the way in which the city engaged with these children's institutions. So one of my views, which I don't know will seem hugely revolutionary, but I do think it's a new take, that is, we tend to presume that these children, I mean, certainly I think anybody who writes on this acknowledges there's a sort of flow of children to the institutions, then they escape, they're rearrested, they're put back in these institutions. But what I think is lost is the way in which the city engaged these institutions, in which the city's, in this case, health, was very much premised on the idea of these institutions functioning. And they are a fundamental part of the tapestry of the city. People knew about them, and they and the surrounding neighborhood most certainly knew of these institutions and the way in which escape could happen. So I'm less interested in the cases of children that are totally isolated by security police and then taken and sent to a very controlled environment. I'm interested in institutions that remained in the city of Odessa. GPU certainly would sometimes participate in these rounds of children, and they are a contributing agency to these arrests, but that didn't mean that these children ended up in GPU institutions. So there were a host of people that were involved, the conventional militia, but also citizens organizations like the Druzy Dite, Friends of Children that were involved as well. And in fact, that's really a concern of mine as well, that I am writing about. That is the way in which normal, for lack of a better term, Soviet citizens became part of this enterprise to, depending on your perspective, take care of children or control children. Certainly that's the expectation. I've written on the Zhinvideli, the women's sections of the Communist Party that were tasked to do this, but and they're the primary branch of the Communist Party that is given this particular instruction, but ordinary citizens employed in Soviet factories and the like were expected to contribute to the control of this particular problem in Odessa, which was, as I've already suggested to you, just by the numbers, was a significant one. I think it just takes picking up the periodical press, and most of it is still housed at the Odessa Scientific Library. It's not the easiest source to work with. They're quite guarded about your use of these very fragile newspapers, but it's there to be found. This perennial problem of children's homelessness that quite simply doesn't go away, as you already noted, right? 1920, but it continues into the 1930s. Certainly, the Holodomor has an effect on the rise of the children's homelessness population.
Thank you very much. I guess I'll go clockwise, and I see now five hands raised. 6. I have two questions here so far. So we'll go. I'll start with you.
Yeah, I have a question that material of which is appended to your talk, and that concerns the labor market in Odessa in the 1920s and early 1930s, and surely there was one there. I don't know what the maximum age of one of these children attendees at this children's camp was? I mean, maybe 12, maybe 14, I have no idea.
By 15 or 16, you're
All right,
already
that way,
being
but
asked to leave.
certainly one could start working earlier. I mean, in the 1930s in the US, people could start working at age 12. And so, would any of the children at this camp at some point, the school, I should say, leave the school and get a job somewhere? Was this encouraged at all?
Absolutely.
Was there vocational training that went on in this school?
All great questions. Absolutely. There's vocational training. There's an expectation. So we've turned off the slides, but partly there's a debate. In fact, I don't need slides to say this. There's a debate on how these institutions should be funded. Again, to take the example that I featured centrally in my discussion, this Comintern Children's Town, it's dependent on municipal funding, right? Local funding. It's taken off the central account, and they're constantly begging for more money. And there's a debate about making it essentially self-reliant through the labor of children. So children were trained to be carpenters, they were trained to be shoemakers, to be tailors, and the like. And there's an expectation of selling those wares to the general public so that in turn funds the maintenance of the city. So that's I suppose the response to one of your concerns. But the other thing that I'm really interested in is what happens when you get too old, right? And a job is not, or more importantly, a domicile is not immediately apparent for you. And so there are children who are entering the labor market and are working outside these institutions who then return for the night in the children's institution. So these sort of 15 to 16 and even older gets to be a concern. They're trying to move them out because they're a weight on the budget of these children's institutions.
Thank you. I think, okay, I will do the following thing. I'm sorry, I will skip Tom and you because you raised your hands a little bit late, and I will go I'll go through the hands that I saw first, and then
I don't mind.
I promise I will come back, because otherwise I will never go through the hands will be raised. So I guess Lada will be the next, and then Patrice, and then I will come back, I promise you.
Okay.
I think my question ties into the previous one. From what you told, would like to talk a little bit more about whether these children were seen as more of a burden and a responsibility versus a resource. And I think especially in terms of what's going now with Russia kidnapping children and the demographic crisis, I could see the children being seen as a resource. And on the one hand, you say that this, a lot of resources were given to try to provide for them. But then there's the other side of your story of how there are no medicines and resources. And on the one hand, it seems like you had the one mention of perhaps the care personnel using their own resources to buy soaps and things for these children. So perhaps this sense of community, but then you also have the children, from the Volga being sent off as quickly as possible, or the girls with syphilis. So Can you talk a bit more about this sense of Soviet idea that children are our future laborers versus these are sort of dregs of society and we don't really.
I mean, there's always a tension there. This never goes away. And that's why, and the children keep getting interned in these institutions through the course of the 1920s and into the 1930s. So the perception of a problem that needs to be handled is certainly persistent, but also the promise of what these children could potentially become. So I would say, in terms of finances, they were never particularly well off or ever particularly well supplied. I didn't mean to give you the impression they were, but they are invaded with a kind of political meaning that is out of step, I suppose, with their finances and their supply. Could we turn the slideshow back on? So sometimes this relates to your concern, but it's good to see you, by the way, Lada. And you know about all this Ukrainianization. I can talk about this more of how I see this as a particularly Ukrainian story all the same, despite the way in which Odessa has been written about in the past. But this very important figure to Ukrainian political history, at least for me, maybe not for everybody in the room, but Anton Prihodko, who is an important figure in my discussion of Ukrainianization in the schools in the 1920s. He is a former Ukrainian SR. He is involved in this debate about how to fund the Comintern Children's Town and whether a new school can be constructed there. So they've essentially retrofitted what they've found, but all through the 1920s, there's a demand for the construction of something specifically dedicated to the objective of educating children. And it's supposed to be an impossibility because of the way in which the budget is allotted, right? So the money is not supposed to come from the center, but the head of the children's town, person of Polish origin, Kochanski, it's a very multi-ethnic story as well, always in Odessa, as in any city really in Ukraine, appeals to Grigory Petrovsky for a remedy. And I found a handwritten note to Prihodko in the archives telling him basically to sort this out. So I don't know exactly how it was sorted out. I don't have an order saying release funds from the central government, or the Republican government with a small r. But nevertheless, the new school was built, so something was arranged. So places like the one I'm featuring here obviously become better provisioned. But I would say the general narrative is one of impoverished supply. But it doesn't take away from the aspiration, is what I would say, and the political meaning invested in these children. And I think one has to be careful in writing this history, right? You don't want to suggest it's just a history of coercion and confinement, because there are records of graduates of these institutions who look back fondly on their time there, but certainly coercion, constraint, and nefarious things going on in these institutions is a part of the story as well.
Thank you. Patrice, please.
Thank you for a really fascinating presentation. I mean, it's so rich here between the geography of the place, the curative qualities of the place, and then the capitalistic danger all at the same time. But what I'm interested in, I have two questions, if I may. Talking about the gendered aspect that you brought up. You didn't mention any women in your pictures. And one of the questions, I think you mentioned that there were women in the party that were responsible for this. If you could say more about that. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing was about your Ukrainian story.
Okay. Thank you, Patrice. Thank you for responding to my invocation for the Ukrainian story. So certainly women were absolutely part of the pedagogical staff of these institutions. Some of them found this particular labor not to their liking, and their stay was relatively short. But it is, I was accustomed and I was trained. I think I'm trying to train my own graduate students to do this is to certainly not just look at the archival record created by the state, but always look at the party archive. And in Odessa, it's not a huge challenge, but before the full-scale invasion, the party archive was held in a different location. And it certainly required, you had to go back and forth between the different different locations of the archive. And the Jeunes Videli, the women's sections of the Communist Party, are really the organization within the party, or the subunit in the party, that is tasked with this. And there's a kind of, I write about this as well in unpublished work, where I'm struggling. I mean, certainly there have been many people who have written on what the Jeunes Videli did, but I do think there's an interesting story to be held here about the early days of their efforts and the way in which they are receiving these children from the Russian Republic. But also, what is fascinating to me is that women are expected to go and engage in these sort of operations, maybe to round up children, but more importantly, receive children that are being sent to them from other institutions, ostensibly to create this children's town that I describe, or other such institutions. And that presumes they have no children of their own, right? So they kind of expected, they're again turned toward, in a very gendered way, to become a sort of maternalistic steward of these children, but it also presumes that they don't have a familial and intimate life of their own. So that's always a tension in what is being pursued. And there's a lot in the archive about women just throwing up their hands, right, and giving. I mean, there's initial sort of ardor, and you inevitably will encounter that in any testimony of a party meeting. But there's also, as you read deeper, real frustration of what is being asked of them, because they're suffering in the very same conditions, maybe slightly improved. But the nuclear family is not particularly well off in Odessa in the early 1920s, and it's a struggle, I would say, really throughout the period I'm investigating. And women activists who are thrown into this role are naturally part of that world, and there's a constraint on what they can do and what they want to do. Yeah. Oh, the Ukrainian story. So, I mean, I just think I was in, that Chomsky he is claiming this city for Soviet Ukraine, right? In my view, so those of you who don't know, right, one of the foremost Ukrainizers, a member of the Boropist party, is a representative of the new Soviet order at a very early date. So it's almost immediately after final Soviet victory of Odessa. If you press me to tell you the history of Odessa in the Civil War, in the Revolution and Civil War, I would be hard pressed to do so. It's immensely confusing. The city changes hands multiple times. But when they finally achieve Soviet victory, it's a future Ukrainizer, certainly a Ukrainian national communist, that takes on this role of trying to lend order and create the new Soviet Ukrainian political order. Then there's what I've already emphasized with Prihodko. But the other thing is, like all places, like all educational institutions in Soviet Ukraine, excuse me, the children are divided up by nationality, right? So in this children's town number 1, model children's town, there's a Yiddish language school, there's Polish language school, there's Ukrainian language school, and then there's an international school, which is basically the Russian population, and I assume others that they have a tough time either classifying, or they're not in a large enough numbers to create their own institution. But that's how, for all these orphans and semi-orphans, they're divided up in this way. And the school and children's home for ethnic Ukrainians is named after Mykola Skripnik, leading Ukrainizer, and there's archival documents about the commemoration of him, the sort of panegyrics to Skripnik. And it just, for someone who knows the later history and knows what happens to Skripnik, it can't help but sit somewhat uncomfortably, right? What would happen to this children's town that was named after Mykola Skripnik, who commits suicide, recognizing his likely political, his political fate was already clear, but his likely very real human fate. So, there's that. And there's one more thing that that was trying to grasp in my brain, but perhaps it will come back to me as I consider another question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, to demonstrate, in order to demonstrate the success of this project, and I think it was also always the aim of Soviet, any Soviet enterprise to show that, to showcase that it is actually successful. It should be shown that these children, that problematic children, grew up into quite normal or maybe exemplary, even Soviet adults. How this was kind of shown. Have you came across stories of success in this exam? Maybe some recollections of, that well-known Soviet citizen that, grew up in this surrounding?
Yes. So I'm not writing about this feature particularly, but it is difficult. I've been asked this question particularly by non-historians. So trying to trace the lives of children in the archival record is a really difficult sort of thing to do. I occasionally get introduced to children's names, particularly if they've been arrested and there's been some judicial proceeding against them. But often the children are sort of anonymous in the archival record. And occasionally you also confront stories about them in the periodical press. So it's tough to trace the continuum of life of particular children, but there are published records of the children from this children's town #1, and the other thing I haven't looked at, and frankly I don't think I ever will, because I just simply was able to take pictures of them, but I wasn't able to fold them. They have at this Odessa Odessa Law Academy, they have letters from the Second World War, right? So children who are graduates of the children's town who served in the Second World War, and they have the letters in the triangular fashion. For those of you who know the history of the Second World War, and it's all folded up. And I think it would take I'm not going back to Odessa right now to investigate that, but they have a sort of published account of alumni, and yes, they are all people that succeeded in Soviet life. There's one claimed cosmonaut, as I recall. But I would be hard pressed to give you specifics on these individuals.
Hi, my question's a little bit similar to Tatiana's, but slightly different focus. It seems to me that you're more interested in kind of the institution and the relationship between the institution and the city, but I wonder in the broader book project kind of how you can account for or try and get at the experiences of the children themselves, because as you said, these are very, they're not present in the archives, they're anonymous, they're kind of like a doubly vulnerable group. If there's kind of any way of really getting at that and getting kind of the perspective from the inside rather than the official?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, this is the constraint of anybody who writes children's history. It has been ever thus. So we have to have exceptional sources to be able to tell these particular stories. I found some again but it's still through the prism of semi-official accounts, right? So I talk about in a very short published work that I did with Elena Palko, and it was this book that was meant to introduce the broader public to Ukrainian history. So we tried to write in a non-scholarly fashion, and I wrote a portion of this story in this particular volume, and I use an article that appeared in a journal for children, and what the article talks about is a diary that the children kept of their particular achievements. Now, again, published in a Soviet journal, we have to be critical in our review of it, but there's a sort of authenticity to what is being printed from this record of a diary, is I guess what I should say, or it's a sort of account of the way in which children are understanding their particular task. It's not particularly labor in the sense of the market, but there is an expectation that they provide for their own sustenance, right? So they're keeping a vegetable garden, and they're chronicling how they were able to do it, and then everything is related, no doubt, through the intervention of a teacher to the political task at hand, right? So weeds are ascribed to enemies of the Soviet state. We need to pull out these weeds, just like we're doing in our garden. There's an expectation that that's going to happen politically as well, or with the society at large. But yeah, it's hard, is what I'd concede. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a related question on voices from the children online. There are two questions, but I will go to the two gentlemen that we already committed. Tonzilis.
Thanks. I'm going to cede my time to other people who are not here as often as I am. My concerns have been addressed. So go ahead.
Okay, so my question was, have you been able, just doing your wonderful job on researching in Odessa, relating to saving children and all of that at the beginning of Soviet power, have you been able to trace the facilities that were used for this first experimental town? Because this is very important also in terms of Ukrainization, and I can give you some heads on that. But have you been able to see that and research, or it was beyond your scope?
So to trace the life of these institutions, or
No, the facilities that were used, the buildings that were used.
yes, yeah. So as I said, there's former imperial orphanages that are being used and repurposed by Soviet authorities. There are former living domiciles that are being repurposed for this particular function. There's a constant swapping. That's the thing that I was struck by in the archival record, right? They get a sort of critical mass and they need to move children to a different institution because there's a new wave of children coming in, or they want to dedicate a particular institution to a more controlled punitive function, right? So not a conventional children's building, but something in the order of a reformatory. And so they're looking for a more secure building as a consequence. But Ukrainianization, as I said, I mean, that's never gone. And, you know, I think this is, forgive me for those of you who are on Zoom, I mean, that certainly I'm always mindful of that. And I do think Sergei knows this very well. You engage in research on the 1920s, you quickly confront Ukrainian language records. It's certainly a misnomer that the records are all in Russian. Why are you learning Ukrainian to study Odessa in the 1920s? In fact, Odessa becomes a place in which Ukrainianization is pushed rather energetically. You can look at my chapter in Breaking the Tongue. I make the argument that they actually seem to be turning the corner because parents by the late 1920s are seeing Ukrainian language and knowledge of Ukrainian language as a tool for success in Soviet Ukraine, and then the narrative shifts from the Central Party. But that's true for these children as well. They're absolutely being exposed to Ukrainian. Children in non-Ukrainian institutions would have still been instructed in Ukrainian. So
this question in part because actually it was a very interesting experiment of using the former summer cottages, one of the first, cooperations in Odessa for this purpose.
Yeah, that's what
Right, and it's also very valuable that number of those cottages were designed by a prominent Odessa local Ukrainian origin architect, Yuri Grigory Dmitrenko. It's well known there. and that's-
Maybe we're talking about the same thing, but this Comintern Children's Town again uses these summer cottages, samopomosh in Russian. Yeah, okay, then we're talking about the same thing. The problem is they actually have trouble evicting the occupants of these cottages who use Soviet, they use Soviet law to try to hold on to their what they view as their property. Ultimately, they're evicted, but there's a complaint in the archival record that maybe we've endowed them with too many rights to hold on to their property. This property we desperately need to house these children. So, which
one of the first Soviet-built schools were also on the premises.
yeah, right, exactly. But this is how children were divided up too, right? So by ethnicity or by nationality, they're divided in these dachas, these former dachas, all of which are sort of self-contained orphanages within this larger orphanage complex.
Okay, thank you. I will go now to the online. Eric Bamis has a question. I have a two-part question. Do we have any voices from the children of Odessa who were swept up to this curative myth-making regime? So that's first part of the question. And second is, what did the training for pediatricians, technicians, and other specialists look like during the period?
I haven't gone deep into it. So this is my student who's asking these questions, quite rightly of me, Eric. So as I said, children's voice is hard to get to. The best way to do it really, I think, remains the periodical press. I mean, it's not perfect, but you're going to see more. There's also the testimony of children who are arrested, right? So that is a kind of voice. But there is a kind of truth, I think, to some of the reporting on children. It's not all propagandistic bombast. There's absolutely engagement by journalists with what they're ascribing to be the thoughts of children, even if it passes through the hands of the journalists who write these thoughts. In terms of, I think that's a very good question. I don't know as much beyond what I've told you about medical training that Odessa was the place to go. is what certainly a major hub for medical training in Soviet Ukraine, and they're graduates of these institutions that I described to you, particularly these institutions associated with infectious diseases. They spread out over Soviet Ukraine. There's a great study in, maybe somebody on Zoom can remind me for the deeply imbued Ukrainianist, but there's a really good study on Kharkiv and the activities of the Kharkiv public health department. I'm trying to construct a similar one in Odessa, but I concede that it's only one part of my story. So I haven't gone deep into the way in which these medical practitioners were trained, only to say that they were most certainly trained locally. Why would you go elsewhere? There probably are instances of folks who found themselves assigned to Odessa, but I think the more true story is Odessan trained medical practitioners being sent elsewhere in Ukraine.
Thank you. And question from John Psitecka, and I guess first sentence, he speaks on behalf of us all. Thanks for great presentation, Matt. And then question, can you say something about how these abandoned children created their own networks for survival? What do we know about the ways in which they helped or aided each other amidst homelessness, disease, and roundups by officials?
Yeah. I mean, this is partly why there is a children's culture that develops outside the institutions that is attractive. Children like the independence of life, free of the confines of the institutions, and they become accustomed to the rather libertine life on the street, right? And they create their own communities, which many aspire to return to after they're incarcerated in view. I mean, what I'm talking about today in terms of my formal presentation is not really a punitive place. In fact, eventually, by the late 20s, early 30s, it's viewed as such an important pedagogical institution that there's families in the area around the children's town that want to send their children to schools in the children's town. So in some ways, I'm not actually, I mean, certainly escapes occurred from here, but it's more likely that they occurred from many of the other deep Budinki children's buildings that populated the city. And yeah, there's a community there that beckons always. And what we have from journalistic accounts is this appealed to children. So it's not surprising that, and some, you know, again, if it's one of my tasks, sorting out what is the truth and the truth about children's feelings, and we've already conceded that's a difficult thing to do. But in model institutions, there is this sort of celebration of what can be gained there, not just in terms of food and good health and all these sorts of things, but the sort of cultural institution. So these pictures I show you are from this photo album that I was given access to at the Odessa Law Academy. But there's pictures of theater and everything that one would associate with the sort of pinnacles of Soviet juvenile life, and that's to be found at a place like this. So it's not as if every institution was rejected, but there is a culture beyond that that certainly motivated children to leave the more punitive institutions that could be found in the city.
Okay, thank you. Officially, we are out of time. So, Oksana, I know that you had a question. Maybe you can ask later. So, I want to thank our today's speaker, Matt. Thank you so much.
Of course.
And thank you for you being super active in terms of questions. I had difficulty managing the lineup. So that's a clear example of a successful talk. So thank you. And before you left, our next event will be on Tuesday, March 24 at noon at the building of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. It's a lecture by Huri Research Fellow Natalia Kudryavtseva, and the title is New Speakers, New Identities, Ideologies of Conversion in Wartime Ukraine. And more information about this and other upcoming events is available on the Huri website. So see you on March 24th.
Thank you. I'd like to stick around for that. Can I stick around?